I would like, how could I talk about my feelings if I can't name exactly like how horrid it is in there? Having the right kind of support around you or what you really need in that moment is amazing. I've had to go back and be like, try and explain why talking about our emotions at home wasn't normal or was hardly done at all. What I was missing in my journey is like, I just want someone to point me in the right direction.
Kia ora, I'm Helen King, and you're listening to Cancer Conversations, the podcast you never thought you'd need for the diagnosis you never want to hear. This episode deals with the topic of death and dying. Take care of yourself and skip this episode if you need to. Today we're talking about grief. Joining me today is someone who is no stranger to loss. Grief coach Hannah Rae works with clients who have experienced loss to help them through that tricky grieving process. She trained as a coach after losing 3 important people in her life in a very short amount of time. A massive thank you to Look Good, Feel Better and Dry July for making this podcast possible. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to good podcasts. So Hannah, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. I've been really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so am I. I think a really good place to start is, when we're meeting someone in terms of what they do for, day to day, is to explain what they do in your own words. So what is a grief coach?
At the moment, I say that I'm a coach specialising in grief and loss because that allows the work more broadly to kind of encompass any kind of life change or transition, which I think is, really important to acknowledge each of those different things and that they can be hard and that sometimes it's really nice to have someone to support you through it. And I when it comes to the grief specifically, I really just think about it as helping people to rebuild and put together their lives after a big loss or the death of someone really close to them, and to work towards that reclaiming a sense of agency in that journey and orient towards like a thriving and aligned life that you love.
It's such a beautiful explanation of what you do, because I think when people are in grief, they really are in their most vulnerable and raw state in a way, because I think as you have, I guess, pointed to, is that grief can often really undo us. And so that idea of meeting people where they are and helping them rebuild is such a good way to kind of frame how we work with grief.
I agree. Yeah.
I think it's also really important to understand how we come to the work we do, because I think it's really interesting that your background is in engineering, and when we spoke before, talked about this very logical sort of industry to work within, and you've grown up in the South Island on a farm that's been in your family for generations. So, you've got that quintessential Kiwi story. And then there's the time in your history where that massive event happened and everything changes for you. And so I want to take you back, and you've described it before in an article that I read as losing your 3 wise men. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, of losing these 3 beautiful men in your life that started off that experience of grief for you.
So, I think how you framed it as definitely living this kind of quintessential Kiwi lifestyle and very kind of living in my masculine, growing up on a farm, living rural life in Christchurch in the big smoke to study engineering, and left university with my engineering degree and ended up spending over a decade in the world of engineering. And yeah, by the kind of through my 20s and by the end of my 20s, I had a life that looked outstanding on paper. Like I did have a really good job. I had a great bunch of friends. By that stage, I was really immersed in the world of endurance sport and multi-sport, the likes of Coast to Coast, training for that. And there's just an amazing community around that type of, it's a certain type of person, and they're all a lot of fun, that gets into that kind of thing. But yeah, even then I just felt like something was missing. Like I ticked off all the boxes, ticked off the way that life was supposed to pan out, and I found myself, feeling really quite lost and hopeless on the inside, not understanding why that was happening, but still on the outside living this, pretty cool life, like going on some cool adventures. But still, putting on this facade like I had my shit together, basically. And so that was kind of leading into my 30th birthday. Things were a wee bit rocky as it was. And then in the months following my 30th birthday, my three wise men all died, all in separate circumstances. And that kind of season of chaos and grief was turned my world upside down and forced me to really reevaluate what I was doing with my life. So that was that life altering event or losses for me that really started to shift and come to see that this life that we have is actually finite, and if there are things that I want to be doing but I'm not right now, then I should actually make an effort and do those things now, because I'm not guaranteed any more time necessarily.
And I think the use of the word three wise men really describes that they were obviously three people in your life that were beacons or pillars of strength or knowledge. Talk me through it, because I mean, you lose your father and a close male friend and your grandfather, which are three people in your life that I guess like they're your wise men, the pillars and people that you imagine being there for other life events, as you go through your 30s. So I can only imagine that being like a bomb going off in your life.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. But before I directly answer that question, I do think that the three wise men actually did, like, I wasn't aware of that in the moment, but kind of at the 12-month mark of the first of those losses, and this was kind of through a series of serendipitous events, that I was running a 5-day ultramarathon in the Wadi Rum Desert in Jordan. And I put out a blog when I was over in Jordan the week before that event, and talking about my three men. And someone commented, like, the three wise men, like, you're in the Holy Land. And not that I have a deep, like, religious or Christian, following. Like, there was just something about that, as you say, really kind of summarized what they meant to me. And I've used that ever since. So thank you for bringing it up. And what was that like? Well, Caleb was my good friend, is my good friend, and he was the first of those three. And well, actually, the week prior to his death, as a family, we'd found out that Dad's cancer that had been diagnosed with 6 months prior, like, they basically had no treatment options left. Wow. So up until that point, I had put a lot of faith in the treatments working. Like, I didn't really entertain the idea of them not, like, that just didn't enter my mind. So when we had that news, that really became a whole lot more real. Like, okay, Dad might not survive this. And that realization, or that tumultuous, like a whole lot of complex emotions, that really felt like too much for me to hold by myself in my own head. So that's when I reached out to Caleb. At the time, he was probably the only person that I'd really started to open up to about my emotions, about my internal world, definitely coming from that, rural background, the Kiwi culture, DIY, everything, kind of just buck up and get on with life. It's in my friendship with Caleb that I'd started to open up a wee bit. And I know that he'd been through some tough stuff, so that I knew that he would get it. He knew pain and heartbreak. So I sent him a message that day when we had the news about Dad, and Caleb was out of town, but we arranged to meet the following week for lunch. And I was like, okay, great. He's going to help me handle and get through this. But it was the 2 days before our lunch date, he was in an accident in the mountains that put him in ICU. So on the day of our lunch date, that's where I was visiting him. And he never regained consciousness, and they took him off life support a couple of days later. That was like the big reckoning of, holy moly, one of my best, closest friends he's gone, and when I really needed someone, and I'm still faced with this possibility or probability that my dad is also not going to be here in the near future. So for me, that was really just like the bottom of my world, just like a trapdoor, just gone into the abyss, and like, which way is up? What is reality anymore? It's a very strange place.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm getting tingles when you're talking, because I know that exact feeling when you realise that everything, like, you're in free fall because something so big has happened in your life, and your brain can't quite comprehend what that is and how to process it. And I think the hardest part when you're going through something like that is trying to be in the world, because no one knows how to interact with you anymore, because they know something's going on, or they know that this big thing has happened, but they're not really sure how to interact with you. And I know for me, with my cancer diagnosis, I didn't know how to relate to the world either. And so all of a sudden there's this big sort of chasm between you and the rest of the world. And I know that you've described it as putting on a brave face and just pretending everything's okay, which I think we often do to protect other people. But I think one of the interesting things about your story is how you ended up in a desert in Jordan doing an endurance race, because I think it's quite it's one of those moments that I think you go, oh, okay, Caleb's still here. He's got a hand in this. So why don't you tell us how you ended up in the middle of the desert in Jordan?
It always makes me smile thinking of how all this panned out. So Jordan is a place, one of probably a handful, that Caleb and I had kind of peppered each other with ideas of adventures in far-flung places, none of which ended up eventuating. We stuck to adventures in New Zealand. But when after Caleb died, and then it was less than 3 months later that my dad ended up dying as well, and kind of sent again into that abyss and that free fall, but kind of with a bit of preparation, knowing that I don't know how I'm going to get through this, but I think I can. And for a long time, I didn't really sleep particularly well at all, which is a totally normal response.
Yes.
And on one of these nights when I just couldn't sleep, like I would try almost everything, like yoga, breath work, all those things. And one night I was just lying in bed scrolling on Facebook, and I saw this ad come up, and it was just win an entry to an ultra marathon in Jordan. And I was like, oh, Jordan, yep, I'm in.
Yeah.
The ultra marathon piece, I was like, oh yeah, like I hadn't done anything quite like that on foot before, but I figured part of me was like, I can do that, but a part of me was also like, grief has just like, I was probably on the edge of what I understand now to be like burnout and chronic nervous system dysregulation, but that grief really just threw that totally out the window too, like fully really dysregulated, like not having any energy at any time. And so on that level, running an ultra was like the last thing I wanted to be doing. But there was just something that I was like, I'm going to click on this. And they just asked for a short piece about why you think you should win. And I put in our wee story about Caleb and how doing that run would be like a tribute to his sense of adventure and our relationship. And I put my entry in and didn't really think anything of it. But at the same time, I just had a sense like, this feels like the right thing to be doing. And a month later, I got the news that I was in and I was off to Jordan.
I just think it's so amazing. And I've been thinking about this leading up to having this conversation with you, that I think it's no wonder that you have done endurance events, because what I understand of endurance events or like high sort of pressure sports is that it actually comes down to often your mindset. Like obviously, your body, you need to have that in a good condition, but it's often our mind that gets in the way of pushing through things, which I think is kind of how grief works as well, is that it does become a mental endurance, but the race kind of has no end in a way, because it's, how do I learn to live with this? How do I learn to be okay with this level of uncomfortableness or that feeling of grief? So I wonder how your experience with endurance races, or even that experience being in the middle of the desert in Jordan, like how that shaped your experience of grief.
Yeah, I love that you asked that, actually, because I've been like, might sound bananas, but it's only the last few months that I've really been exploring that as a link or a metaphor or something to kind of share or speak around a bit more. So it's still in the early days of figuring out, like, the bullet point version of what that is. But when I think about the days in the desert, and it's the same but different, because this is something that I had, in a sense, chosen to do. And so you can't kind of go into the middle of it and just be like, what am I doing, when like you chose to do this?
Yes.
But in another way, there was also this, like, I feel like I didn't know what it was, but I just had this sense that I'm going to do this, I'm supposed to be here, and I'm going to finish. And there were, like, I think about a quarter of the people who started didn't finish for various reasons, whether it was gut issues or injury or blisters or just heat stroke, because it's so bloody hot. And I think, like, for me, I definitely had a couple of days where it was like, the finish line of that stage just felt so far away. And it was just about, like, I know I can take one more step. And I think that's kind of the piece that, what's the word? Like, relates into the journey with grief really well, is that we can always do one thing. It doesn't have to be a big step, but it can just be one thing.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a couple of things there that come to mind. I remember when I started chemo, and you, in that first round, you don't know what to expect. All you know is that your oncologist has given you all of these meds to deal with these side effects that you may or may not have. And so it's quite frightening walking into that. But once I'd had that first round, I knew what to expect. And it was that thing of, I know on these days I'm going to feel worse, but I'll come out the other side. And so it was just going, I can do it one day at a time, one step at a time, I'll keep going. Because there's a lot of time alone when you're going through cancer treatment, which I think is similar to when you're grieving, is those times when you're alone, and that feeling of grief can be so overwhelming and so present, and you're alone with your head, and it's that, I guess that push to go, no, I can get through this, which I imagine is what happens when you're in the middle of the desert with blisters all over your feet and people have dropped out, that it's, how do I deal with this discomfort and know that it will pass?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's hard because we know that, we're not designed to do this alone, and maybe we'll talk about that a bit later, but, having the right kind of support around you, like aligned support for what you really need in that moment, is amazing. And also, no one else can step into our shoes and make it any easier. Like, there's still that element of you are the one doing this and living this. And like, this ties back into endurance sport as well. It's like when you're in a team, you're all trying to get through a course as efficiently as possible and as fast as possible. So everyone's kind of looking out for each other. And if you're having a tough time, they'll be like, what do you need? Do you need, and as a solo participant, we do this as well. Like, I'm really, like, my mind's going to an awful place, or I'm really struggling right now. Like, do I need layers on, layers off? Do I need sugary treat? Do I need something savory? And it's, through endurance and through those years of training and racing, like, I learned about myself and what, if I'm feeling like I'm really struggling, it's not the end of the world. I just need to figure out what I need. And that ties into, grief or something else that's really challenging too, is that element of self-awareness and knowing ourselves well enough, or practicing that, exploring that, to be able to understand what it is that we need in any given moment.
I think that's quite a challenging one, and there's two things there. That idea that we're not meant to do this alone at all, especially the hard stuff. But I think that, grief and loss, especially when someone's, lost a loved one, a lot of us have no idea how to respond to that. And so they kind of back off. And also, a lot of us aren't okay with being present and, sitting in the presence of people who are having really big emotions. We want to kind of make it stop or, fix them, when sometimes actually we need to let each other just fall apart. Because sometimes you need to fall apart to be able to really, get back up and put yourself back together. Which I think ties into something, because you wrote a beautiful article, and the words were just, it resonated with me a lot as someone who has dealt with a lot of grief in a short amount of time as well. That idea that nature has a way of holding space for us. And I love that so much because I moved back to where I grew up, which was sort of like a semi-rural part of Auckland and right in the middle of the bush. And so I spent a lot of time in the past year like in the bush by myself or with my dogs or down at the beach when no one else is there. And it's a really strange feeling being on a rugged West Auckland beach with this amazing nature around you, but you are sitting in this tremendous sort of grief or sadness. But it does have this amazing way of just holding you there and grounding you and helping you know that that one more step. Did you have moments like that in the middle of the desert, and is that where that need for being in nature started, or had that started before?
The being out in the desert was not the type of nature or environment that I was used to. Definitely the New Zealand mountains and tussock country and beach forests is definitely more my comfort zone.
Yes.
It had definitely kind of became a support for me before I went to Jordan. So it was 5 weeks after Caleb's passing. I something I committed to months, if not even a year prior, to a 6-day endurance mountain bike race in the New Zealand backcountry. And so around the time of his death was when I was supposed to be doing another big phase of just huge kilometers and lots of climbing in preparation for this event. And I talked to my coach about it. Maybe I should have just pulled out. Probably would have been the best idea. But she just said probably being outside is really good for you right now. And just go on your bike and keep it easy. Put it in the granny gears going up the hill and just spin away. And at the time, I'd been living in Christchurch, and a lot of that training I did out on Banks Peninsula. And there's definitely a favourite training ground of mine is, we're parking at a little river or over in Akaroa and just pedaling my way up the hills and then onto the tops and then back down to a bay. It's just stunning. And I think that probably what is present there that ties into all the other experiences I had was just that vastness, like when you're up the top and on a clear day you can see all the way across the west across the Canterbury Plains to the Southern Alps, north to Kaikoura and then south down the coast as well. And it's just that sense of bigness, I think. I definitely had experiences in other ways and other places as well, but I think that common thread is that space and maybe something about kind of being a little bit closer to the sky. I don't know what that is, but it's something I've noticed. And just that there's no judgment that comes from being out in nature. And it definitely allows, whether it's on that scientific level or a more energetic, intuitive level, that space to just be held by our Mother Earth.
Yeah, I think so. And as you were talking, I've started thinking about another idea, because I think humans have done this for a long time, and I always think about the El Camino track in Spain, and that has always been like a pilgrimage. And I wonder whether when we do something like that, a big walk, or I know a lot of people after they've done cancer treatment, they train for a marathon, these sorts of things, and it becomes a physical expression or a physical journey that kind of helps us move through some of that grief. Just walking it out, or doing an endurance race in the Jordan desert. Because grief, you can't see it. Like, we know that people grieve, or you can explain that I've lost my loved one and it hurts, but it's really difficult to have a physical manifestation of our grief that we can sort of tangibly kind of like touch and work through. And so I wonder whether some of that, being in nature or doing big walks or events is a way of grounding ourselves in that and moving it through our bodies.
Yes. There's a couple of things that come to mind for me in that. And the first of that is the impact that like grief or a loss or a big change can have on our our bodies at a cellular level, at that nervous system level, and that relatively gentle movement is 100% a way of shifting that. It's not the only way, there are definitely other ways, but walking is, for me, is pretty accessible. Pop out the door and onto the, 500 meters down the street and we're on the beach at the lake. So, and of course, spoilt for choice throughout, Southland and the South Island and the North Island too for, that kind of access.
With the type of grief coaching, the coaching you do with people who are in grief, it's really interesting because when we first spoke, you mentioned that part of the reason that you were drawn to it was because you didn't really have anything at the time that would help you with what you were experiencing. And I've definitely had that too, where, you've gone through this tremendous loss and it's really hard to figure out who can help me with this or where can I go to move through it. And I think part of it for me is that I'm someone that wants things to happen really quickly. I want to be better now. I want, just get on with things. And it has been a real learning process to understand that I will always feel these losses. They will always be there, but the growth comes from, I guess, the jar around it gets bigger. And I don't touch the edges as often. It still really hurts when I do. But it becomes easier to be in the world and in my body than sort of, away somewhere else trying to not to sort of feel what's going on. So what was that process like for you to decide I'm going to retrain and help people through this process?
I think the seed was probably planted pretty early on. And when I was trying to do the best that I could to support myself, the common advice is, that talking about it is a good thing. And so I followed that advice and spoke with a counsellor over the phone in the early days after Dad had died and spoke with her for a few sessions over those first weeks and months. But honestly, I didn't actually find it that helpful. I had already been doing all the things she suggested that would help. And a lot of that is just making sure that you're trying to sleep and are eating and getting some exercise and connection, which are all great suggestions. But I was already I had 3 months of practicing how to do this.
Yes.
And she also brought in the 5 stages of grief model, which by that stage I already knew was bullshit. So I was like, this doesn't feel right, but I know it's good to be talking about it, so I'm just going to stick it out for a wee while. And then I basically put talk therapy or counselling to the side for almost a year after that. And somewhere in the murk of all of that first year, I definitely made a pact to myself that if and when I ever had the capacity to, I know none of this is ever going to be fixed, but if I am in a space where I feel comfortable to be able to be that person who has lived through it, and has, just that lived wisdom of an experience, practical ways to support yourself and to get through it. I just decided I'm going to do that. And a couple of years ago, that time came.
That's so cool. It's funny, I put on Instagram after we had our first conversation and just sort of talking about that, and because we mentioned that often when these things happen when we're younger, part of the challenge is that we're going through things that most of our peers aren't. And so for you, it's losing loved ones so young. For me, it was going through cancer and then facing my mortality, the fact that I'm not going to have children, and all of this stuff. And it was interesting because I had other people message me and say, oh yeah, it was the same for me. A friend had her child when she was 18 and then she lost her dad at 21. And she talked about that exact same thing, where it was like all of a sudden there was something that set her aside because her friend group couldn't understand what she was going through. And I know a lot of other people who are younger when they've had cancer have that same experience because they may not be hitting those, milestones that we're meant to when everybody else is. And sometimes I think that is part of the grief, is that we don't get to engage and do the things that society says we're meant to do at certain stages. And so I'd love to know your experience with that of, losing a parent at a younger age and trying to figure out, I guess, where to find that help or how to process that.
It is hard. And I really, just encourage people to seek out a support that works for them. And I know this can be hard, like keep trying until you find something that is 100% aligned to you and your experience, and is the right type of support too. Like I said before, like that common advice is, maybe you should be talking to someone, and it's well-meaning, but depending on what you're facing or where you're at, it might not be the most helpful thing to be doing, and especially when there's so many options out there. And I think, like, reflecting on my own experience too, like in those early days, and speaking with a counsellor because I felt like I should, but there was also an element of I couldn't describe, like I didn't have the words for what I would like. How could I talk about my feelings if I can't name exactly like how horrid it is in there? And that's when I'd been practicing yoga for several years at that point, but mostly it's just a performance tool. Like that's the kind of mentality that I was in, strength and stability and mobility, as well as that yin style yoga where if I can rest hard, then I can perform better. Which is, it was just so part of my world and thinking back then. But when it came to grief, like it really unlocked a whole new dimension in yoga for me, especially in yin, and having my body, be in a space where I could rest and be nourished and kind of cultivate a sense of safety and allow, we know that so much of what we experience is moved through or is even stored in our bodies. So for me, like yin yoga was the place for that to happen. And I didn't, sometimes there was like an emotional, like I would cry or there would be some really upsetting emotions that would come up, and I didn't have to talk about it. They just came out. And for me, that really kind of sent me on this whole new curious path of exploring the body-based supports and therapies. And I think, so if someone has been suggested or advised that talking to someone might be good, then, it might be, but also don't be afraid to go and explore other options that you feel drawn to.
I think that's a really good point. And as you were talking, something came to mind. that I've learned, especially over the past 6 years since my diagnosis, is that we often can't actually start processing what's happened until we feel safe. And so, for instance, if you're going through cancer treatment, absolutely having the support there is the right thing to have. But it will not be until treatment has ended and you're kind of getting back into things when it hits you. Because you're in survival mode. And I imagine the same, like when you've just had the traumatic event, it takes a while for, I think, your body and brain to kind of catch up and go, what the fuck was that? To put it so crudely. But I think that's something that we need to acknowledge, that when you're in the thick of it is not when you're going to process it. And it's often, when we feel safe, or we find someone that we do feel safe with. Because I agree with talk therapy has its place, and it's, helped me in different ways. But I've tried, I've done things like EMDR therapy, which has been great to desensitize some of the medical trauma that I experienced having cancer. Recently, what I've been doing is drawing particular things. And that's really helped me move through emotions that I've got attached to certain things, because your body does store it, and I think my experience with trauma or loss is it often takes us out of our bodies because the present moment can be so painful, you don't want to be there anymore. And so that process of coming back into your body and allowing yourself to feel those tensions or those feelings is such a huge process. And it is, it's so much more than the 5 stages of grief. It's like the 1,000 stages of grief.
I wonder how, not that we measure things by time frames, but I think I have my kind of experience in mind, but I'd be curious for you, like, what was that? When did you feel like you had the capacity to enter, if that was related, like the talk therapy space, and to kind of start integrating that from the cognitive side?
Yeah, it took a while because I had chemo brain, so my brain felt like cotton wool anyway. And then there's so much pressure to go back to work and things. And so I think it took a good couple of years to really feel less in the, I guess the frozen deer of just being still so shocked of what had happened. But then we had the pandemic. So that sort of added a different layer. But I think the real deep work, or a lot of the work that I've done, has been in the past 2 or 3 years. So it's taken a while. It's taken a while to get to the point where I felt that I've been able to pull away some of those layers. Yeah,
that's very similar to me. And I think that's just helpful to highlight, that is that I know I fell like entirely into this trap too, is that after my dad died, I read Resilient Grieving by Lucy Hone. I was like, right, I'm going to tick it off. I'm going to be gold star student at doing this grief thing. And then it's like, right, I'll get to a year and cool. And I know this is not everyone's experience, but I found the second year equally, if not more difficult than the first, or maybe difficult in a different way that I hadn't anticipated. And I imagine your experiences have been similar, with a few differences in there too. But like it is, and it's not just time either. It is that intentional, like, what supports can I bring in? What makes me feel safe, or do I need support to start cultivating that safety in my body? And sometimes that is just where it starts, and it's not until you have that more sense of being out of the whether it's the thick of it or the danger zone, it's not until you're in a more kind of stable or safer environment, both individually and in the wider context.
Yeah.
Like COVID is a great example of not having that in the wider context. The time is just absolutely not linear at all.
It really isn't. It's not linear. Healing isn't linear, and I think that's really important for people to remember. And I was exactly the same, because I've always been a high achiever and pushing, like, what boundary can I push? And so it was, once radiation was over, I was like, right, I've got to get well, I've got to heal, all of this pressure on myself. And of course, that just leads to burnout or not getting into a better space, because it really has been time and figuring out what I've needed, and just really addressing some of the trauma of having a cancer diagnosis. And I think, another layer for me sort of revealed itself last year when I got to the 5-year mark post-diagnosis, and I said to my surgeon, is this actually is this significant? Because I'd heard, you hear in the cancer world, it's like, if you get to 5 years, that's, a good time frame. And so I was feeling a bit suspicious. I think it's like, is this actually something that I should be celebrating?
Yeah.
And he confirmed to me what I'd kind of known, was it had been year to year for me, of will I get through another year without a reoccurrence? And so I think that makes it harder sometimes when you are living with something that could come back. It makes it harder to sort of let go. And I didn't realise until that point when he said to me, I think, I bet my house on it that you're going to be okay. And I just let go. And I didn't realise that I'd probably been subconsciously holding my breath up until that point. And I guess that's a very long way of saying that, it takes time, because there are so many facets to loss or trauma that you're going to go through. And that was another layer for me of going, I've been walking around for 5 years with this thing hanging over me. And now it's time to kind of breathe out.
And I think that is, that's not been something I've experienced. I can never know what that's like, but it's different from like a bereavement, where kind of like the worst has kind of happened. It's still really hard and shitty, and yes, there'll be ups and downs and loop-de-loops and whatever, but it's not something. And I think that's, maybe it's like living with a cancer diagnosis, or that question of that 5-year mark definitely adds. And I wonder if that goes kind of under the radar or under acknowledged in that space, that is actually something that's basically a threat that is there all the time, and that's a huge version of loss to be living with.
I think also it's good to acknowledge with bereavement, because when you enter into the cancer community, it's the club no one wants to belong to, but you are witness to a lot of loss and bereavement, because people will die, especially when you're younger. It is a very different disease, and so you do witness a lot of people dying far too young. And I think it's a good time to acknowledge as well, as part of that process of grieving, is that it's okay if you never stop grieving, because you have lost someone that should have been there with you. Like your 3 wise men should have been with you. And I think that is part of that, the overwhelming pain of bereavement and loss is there is literally something missing.
And it always, like, there's those milestones memories, even just like day-to-day stuff. But yeah, like it's over the weekend that has just been, it would have been my dad's 65th birthday. So it's been his big like retirement celebration, and I can't imagine how he would have gone in retirement, but he might have had a bit of fun with a gold card. But yeah, that's definitely like it rips my heart to not see him get to enjoy a retirement that he's worked so jolly hard for, and for us kids as well. Like, yeah, it's hard, especially like the day-to-day stuff is hard, but then there's the milestones too that you know that they are in a sense missing out on.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking back to something you said earlier, and I feel like so many of us will be able to relate with this, of that Kiwiness of not talking about our feelings. we don't do that. And so obviously you have stepped into that, you've really leaned into that, especially with going into coaching and providing a space for people to do that. If there are people who are struggling with it at the moment, what was the one step that you took that allowed you to do that differently and to start being open to feeling your feelings and expressing things?
Yes. So first, I do like it brought the way you introduced that brought to mind something a friend said to me a few weeks ago. She's been in New Zealand for about 10 years, but is originally from Germany. And she said that when she first arrived in New Zealand, that it was like walking into a strange science experiment where no one was really honest about how they were feeling or what was going on in their lives. And I just thought that was the best way to describe it, because I've also been in part of what I'm working on at the moment is writing my story into a memoir, and part of that has involved joining writing courses, and I was part of a mastermind with a bunch of beautiful women who are all based in America. And because you can't see the soup that you've brought up in or that you're living in. And they were like, what is this thing about Kiwis not talking about things? And so that really highlighted to me. And in my writing, I've had to go back and be like, try and explain why talking about our emotions at home wasn't normal or was hardly done at all. So I think grounding it in that context of this is the reality of the Kiwi culture, we can start to kind of unpack it from there. And also you're not the only one, and we can bring compassion to that's especially in the coaching and personal development world. It is a lot of very individual focus, which is great. We spoke about that before. You can be you're the only one, the hero or the heroine of your journey. And there are a whole lot of factors that came into making you who you are, that some of those are out of our control. Some of them we can reflect on and change. Understanding the context of us and how we got to this place of not being open about hard things or emotions or showing any signs of weakness is more a product of other things. It's not just an individual problem. And for me, what started to shift that for me was, it actually came out about 10 months after Dad's death. And kind of actually in that time, there's those first 12 months after Caleb died were with endurance events, the deaths, the grief. I also fell in love with a guy who loves being out in the hills as much as I do. And I look back on it now, I'm just like, how on earth did that work? And we're still together now. So there's a bit of magic in that. but yeah, it was a conversation with him, and he's been through his own tough stuff, and he's very compassionate and gentle, but can be firm when he needs to be. But yeah, he just, like, I was going along and thought, I'm coping with this stuff fine. Like, I've got this, I'm maybe not that excited about life, but like, I'm functioning. And it wasn't until one night after dinner, we sat down and he was just like, I wonder if it's time for you to seek some kind of support. Don't know what it is, whatever's going to work for you, because the way that you are behaving is starting to impact me and our relationship. My first response was like, how dare you? You know, like, how hard this is. But I held that in. And the next more rational part was just like, oh, he's probably right. He wouldn't say something like that for no reason. And so for me, it wasn't, I could have gone a lot longer just thinking I was doing fine if it wasn't for him highlighting the impact that it was having on him. And by nature of that, it was probably impacting other people that I was spending time with as well, with work and friends and family. So not everyone will have a person to reflect that kindly back to them. But maybe it's something that you can just reflect on yourself. And I think deep down we know when we're being not such a great human, and sometimes that's perfectly valid, but sometimes it's I actually do need help with this.
Very, very true. My brain's ticking over because I was thinking I had a moment like that a few months ago.
I mean, we all do. It's so human.
That's exactly it. It is human. It is human to grieve. It is human to lose things. It's human to feel joy, and which I think is a really nice place to, I guess, wrap up our conversation. Even though I feel like I could ask you a million more questions. But in that beautiful article you wrote, there was a piece in it which really resonated with me. And so I would like to know, what makes your soul smile now?
Oh, yeah, that's a beautiful question. So many little things, and that are part of my day-to-day, and I do that intentionally because I know that grief is an ongoing thing, and there's always milestones, like my dad's retirement birthday would have been over the weekend, and other things, and things that are happening locally, nationally, globally. Like, there's a lot of shit going on, and I think it's almost like it's my duty to seek out and cling on to those things that do make me smile, and do that every single day, just as like a bare minimum, especially during winter down here. Winter in Fiordland can be hard work. It's just a really nice coffee in the mornings. It's seeing the sun coming through the trees or sunset on the lake. It's fresh air, it's walking in the bush, and sometimes I go bushwalks before work, and sometimes that's with friends as well, and we watch the sun come up and the sunlight coming through the trees, and I mean, there's so much nature infused into that. It's just nature is what makes my soul smile.
I love that. That's been part of my process too, so I understand that, and just holding on to those small moments, because sometimes that's all you can do, is those little moments going, yep, that bit was okay. That was quite beautiful before it gets overwhelming again. So Hannah, if people want to follow you or get in contact with you, what's the best way of finding you online?
You can jump over to Instagram at @RaeWildGrief, and if there's any part of this conversation that has sparked some ideas or new perspectives or maybe some questions, then yeah, I know that like a life-changing loss or adversity can change everything. So yeah, if you've resonated with anything, then I'd love to hear from you. Send me a DM, or yeah, we can book in a free chat. I'm very there's no obligation. I'm very open with those. As you know, and this is what I was missing in my journey. It's like I just want someone to point me in the right direction. And so if it's working with me, or if I can connect you with someone else in my network, then I love to do that too.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that vulnerable story and being raw and real with us. I think as often as we can have conversations about our feelings and show that this, that we can do it. So thank you so much for having this time with me.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure, and I so admire you for what you're doing as well, and definitely having these conversations about emotions out loud is awesome. So let's all keep up the great work.
Thanks for joining me. If you want to find out more about what's on offer from Look Good Feel Better, head over to www.lgfb.co.nz and join me next week for another cancer conversation.